Picture this. You're a peasant in a small European village, your hands caked with mud as you sow seeds in a field. Above you, a knight in shining armor gallops past the castle, his lance catching the light of the afternoon sun. Meanwhile, far away in a monastery, a monk meticulously copies lines of scripture, preserving knowledge that could easily be lost to time. And beyond the seas, a merchant in the Islamic Golden Age weighs spices and precious stones, unaware that his discoveries will one day touch your life. This isn't just the stuff of storybooks or Hollywood. It's a period in history that has shaped who we are today in ways more profound and interconnected than you might think. So grab your time-traveling helmets because we're going on a journey through an era that was anything but dark. The end of the Roman Empire around 476 AD wasn't just a full stop. It was more like a comma that signaled a dramatic shift. As the Roman legions retreated and the grandeur of Rome dimmed, Europe moved into what many call the medieval era. Now you might have heard this period referred to as the Dark Ages, but that term is largely a misnomer, reinforced by Renaissance scholars who saw their time as an enlightenment and the preceding years as dark by comparison. In reality, the so-called Dark Ages were periods of significant scientific discovery, cultural development, and far-reaching trade, although at a different scale and direction than before. And speaking of scale and direction, it's essential to understand the geographical scope of the Middle Ages. While it is often Eurocentrically focused on what was happening in England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, the Middle Ages were a global phenomenon to an extent. Europe was undoubtedly the epicenter, but its ripples extended into the Byzantine Empire in the East, the Islamic Golden Age in the Middle East, and even influenced the emerging African and Asian civilizations. At the heart of the Middle Ages was the feudal system, a hierarchical arrangement that functioned almost like a pyramid. At the top were the kings and queens, who were essentially landowners on a grand scale. Below them, nobles and lords managed large expanses of this land. The knights, often vassals to these lords, were the muscle that kept the machine running. They provided military service in exchange for pieces of land known as fiefs. And at the bottom were the peasants and serfs, who worked the land and were bound to it, often for life. Within this pyramid, roles were clearly defined. Kings and queens held divine or legal authority, but were often constrained by their dependence on nobles for military support. Nobles were power brokers, holding court, dispensing justice, and often acting as mini-rulers within their dominions. Knights served dual roles. They were warriors and minor lords, often striving to climb the social ladder through valor and service. Peasants and serfs were the economic backbone, although they had little upward mobility. But how did the economy sustain itself during these times? Enter manorialism, the economic twin of the feudal system. Manorialism was essentially a contract between the lord of the manor and his serfs. The lord provided protection and a piece of land to cultivate, while serfs provided labor and a portion of their harvest back to the lord. This was more than just a transactional relationship. It was a deeply ingrained social contract that laid the economic foundation of medieval society. So, when you think of the Middle Ages, envision a complex web of interdependent roles, bound not just by hierarchy, but also by a multifaceted economic system. Religion was the lifeblood of the Middle Ages. The church wasn't just a place to pray. It was a political and social powerhouse. It had its own laws, courts, and vast lands. Popes and bishops wielded influence comparable to secular rulers, often acting as mediators and advisors to kings. The church also shaped ordinary people's daily lives, providing spiritual guidance, education, and social services. Monasticism deserves a special mention here, as monasteries were not just religious enclaves, but centers of education, agriculture, and healthcare. The monks copied books, preserved ancient texts, and advanced the sciences, creating islands of learning and culture. They also introduced innovative agricultural techniques that benefited the local economy. In essence, Monasteries were their time's think tanks and community centers. But let's not forget the Crusades, military expeditions primarily aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land from Islamic rule. While the Crusades are often critiqued for their violence and colonial nature, they also had profound cultural impacts. They opened channels for exchanging ideas, technologies, and goods between the Islamic world and Christian Europe, paving the way for the Renaissance. Think of them as consequential crossroads where East met West, reshaping both spheres in subtle and significant ways. So, it's crucial to recognize the omnipresent role of religion in the Middle Ages, not just as a spiritual doctrine, but as a multifaceted force that impacted governance, economy, and cultural evolution. If you're enjoying this journey through the fascinating Middle Ages, subscribe for more historical deep dives, myth debunking, and captivating tales from different epochs. Moving on to the captivating world of culture and learning in the Middle Ages, a sphere often overlooked but which is brimming with ingenuity and creativity. When it comes to art, two styles stand out: Romanesque and Gothic. Romanesque art is characterized by thick walls, rounded arches, and a focus on symmetry. Come the 12th century, the Gothic style emerged, bringing with it pointed arches, intricate facades, and towering cathedrals that tried to touch the heavens, quite literally. These architectural and artistic shifts weren't just aesthetic. They symbolized the period's evolving mindsets and theological understandings. In the realm of thought, Scholasticism was groundbreaking. This method blended faith with reason, leveraging the logic of Aristotle to grapple with theological questions. The University of Paris and other emerging institutions became epicenters where philosophers like Thomas Aquinas sought to harmonize religious beliefs with intellectual rigor. Literature, too, saw a seismic shift as vernacular works, those written in the local language rather than Latin, gained prominence. Dante's Inferno offered a vivid tour of hell that resonated with laypeople and scholars alike, while Chaucer's Canterbury Tales gave us snapshots of medieval life across social classes. Not to forget Beowulf, an Old English epic that explored heroism and fate, themes that reflected the values and fears of its time. And let's not underestimate the era's technological marvels. Windmills harnessed the power of nature to grind grain, revolutionizing agriculture. Eyeglasses improved the quality of life, while the invention of the printing press around the 15th century democratized knowledge like never before. These innovations didn't just make life easier, they transformed the social and economic landscape. Another enticing aspect that is both fascinating and grim is warfare and technology in the Middle Ages. First up are castles and fortifications, which were far more than just royal residences. These were strategic military centers designed for both offense and defense. From the early Motte and Bailey designs, castle architecture evolved into grand stone fortresses with multiple layers of defense, like concentric walls and moats. These architectural innovations often turned castles into nearly impregnable strongholds, forcing the development of siege technologies to break through. Speaking of technology, innovations in weapons and tactics dramatically changed the face of medieval warfare. The longbow, for instance, had a range and accuracy that gave English archers a decisive advantage in battles like Agincourt. On the heavier end of the spectrum, the trebuchet could fling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over castle walls, revolutionizing siege warfare. These technologies didn't just lead to more effective fighting, they altered military strategies and even the outcomes of wars. Turning our attention to chivalry, let's examine the code of conduct that guided knights in the Middle Ages. Far from being mere brutes in armor, knights were expected to follow a complex set of ethical guidelines, which included loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, and courtesy toward enemies and civilians alike. However, it's worth noting that the ideal of chivalry was often more aspirational than practical, and the realities of medieval warfare were far less romantic. Yet, The very existence of this code reveals much about the societal values and norms of the time. As medieval warfare wasn't just about brute force, it was a complex interplay of technology, strategy, and even ideology. A pivotal moment that significantly altered the course of history was the Black Death, a catastrophic plague that wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. The social and economic repercussions were enormous. Labor shortages empowered peasants to demand better conditions, accelerating the breakdown of the feudal system. The plague also spurred scientific inquiry into medicine, ultimately ushering in a more empirical approach to understanding diseases. Then, the Hundred Years' War between England and France, which stretched from 1337 to 1453, was not just a protracted conflict over territory, but a transformative event that contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of nationalism. Large standing armies were formed for the first time, many of them made up of commoners, not just knights. This shift weakened the feudal structure, where military power was primarily in the hands of the nobility, and fostered a sense of national identity as people began to see themselves as part of a larger collective, bound by language and culture rather than just feudal obligation. Finally, a quick teaser about the Renaissance. Far from being a sudden break from the dark Middle Ages, the Renaissance was a flowering of art, science, and philosophy that had its roots in the medieval period. Think of it as the fruit from seeds planted during the Middle Ages, seeds of inquiry, artistic experimentation, and cross-cultural exchange. So, remember that the Middle Ages were not a standalone chapter in history. They were a crucial bridge to the modern era, filled with transformative events and innovations that still echo through time.